The morning of September 29th, 1886, arrived the way most mornings did in Coldwater Creek, Wyoming, with a sky so blue it looked painted the air, carrying just enough chill to remind you that summer had already made its exit without saying goodbye. The cottonwoods along the creek bed had gone amber and gold, their leaves trembling in a wind that came off the northern ridgeline like a whisper before a shout. It was the kind of morning that made men feel certain about things, certain about their cattle, their land, their understanding of what the coming months would bring. Clara Voss stood at the northern edge of town with a wool blanket folded over one arm, a cloth sack of cornmeal hanging from her right hand, and her father's knife tucked into the belt of her dress. She was 11 years old, small even for that, with dark brown hair braided tight against the back of her neck, and eyes the color of storm clouds over the Wind River Range, gray-blue, direct, unbothered. The kind of eyes that had seen things settle into permanent shape at an age when most children still believed the world could be argued with. Behind her, Coldwater Creek watched from behind glass. Curtains pulled aside just enough. Faces that did not come out. The door of the general store stayed closed. The door of the smithy stayed closed. Even the door of the house where she had last slept, the Pruitt house, the only one whose occupant had not voted the way everyone else voted, stayed closed because Edna Pruitt was a woman of limited power in a town run by men who confuse volume with authority, and she had spent her one protest 2 nights ago in a room that did not want to hear it. Clara did not look back. Looking back was for people who had left something worth remembering behind them. She walked north. Edmund Voss had come to Wyoming in 1865 with nothing particular in mind except distance from the city of Philadelphia, which had asked too much of him for too many years and given back too little. He was 23 years old, the son of a Scottish-English merchant family that had expected him to follow a ledger into a respectable middle age. He followed a different thing instead, the specific quality of silence that only exists in places where no human structure interrupts the sight line from horizon to horizon. He became a trapper because it was the most honest work he could find. You put in effort, you got a result. The land did not deceive you, did not promise things it could not deliver, did not change the terms after the agreement was made. Edmund respected that. Over 20 years in the Wyoming Territory, working the mountain systems that fed into the Sweetwater and the Wind River, he accumulated not wealth but knowledge, the specific, layered, cross-reference kind of knowledge that can only be built by a man who pays attention to the same square miles of land across decades of changing seasons. He met Clara's mother in the spring of 1874 in the brief interval when he came into a settlement to sell furs and buy supplies. She was a school teacher from Ohio, 26 years old, 3 months into a position at the settlement's small school, still surprised by the texture of the western sky. They were married by October. Clara arrived in April of 1875, and Clara's mother did not survive the effort. Edmund did not know how to process grief in any way that involved other people. He processed it the only way he knew, by going back into the mountains, taking his daughter with him, as soon as she was old enough to travel without constant supervision, which he determined was around age 4. The settlement's women thought this was reckless. Edmund thought their opinion was irrelevant. He wrapped Clara in furs, put her in a carrier on his back, and walked her into the Wind River foothills on a Tuesday morning in June of 1879, while 3 women on a porch watched with their mouths slightly open. What Edmund taught his daughter was not a curriculum. It had no sequence, no textbook, no formal structure. It was more like a long conversation that began when Clara was 4 and was still ongoing the morning he did not come home. He showed her how beaver dams recorded winter severity, the way tree rings recorded drought, the height of the dam correlating directly with the depth of snow the colony expected, because a beaver colony operating on instinct that had been refined over thousands of generations did not overbuild without reason. He showed her how the timing of elk migration down from the high country was a measurement instrument more reliable than any almanac, because the elk were not guessing. Their bodies held information their ancestors had deposited across centuries of survival. He showed her the woolly bear caterpillars banding the squirrel's acceleration of caching behavior, the specific restlessness that settled over animal populations in the weeks before a severe weather system moved in, a restlessness that was different in quality from ordinary seasonal adjustment, sharper, more urgent, carrying the frequency of genuine biological alarm. None of this was magic. Edmund was precise about that. It was observation pattern recognition, the disciplined comparison of current conditions against the accumulated baseline of previous years. What made it powerful was not any mystical quality, but the simple fact that almost no one did it. Most people looked at the sky. Edmund looked at everything. Clara absorbed it the way children absorb things before they know they are being taught completely, without resistance, without the interference of prior assumptions that needed to be dismantled first. By the time she was 7, she was reading the land alongside her father, rather than simply following his interpretations. By 8, she was occasionally catching things he had missed. Edmund Voss was attacked by a grizzly bear in July of 1884 in a narrow canyon above the upper Sweetwater where he had gone to check a trapline. Clara was 9 years old. She waited 3 days at their camp because Edmund had told her had made her repeat it back to him multiple times that if he did not return within 3 days, she was to follow the creek downstream until she reached a trail, then follow the trail to the nearest settlement. She waited 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, she went looking for him instead. She found him by tracking the ravens. A large gathering of ravens in a terrain without obvious carrion source was a specific kind of sign, and she knew what it meant before she reached the canyon. She buried him in the hard summer earth of the canyon floor, using his own knife, the ground giving way in grudging increments. It took her most of a day. She stacked flat rocks over the mound the way she had seen done in pictures, and she stayed until she was certain she had done it right, because there was no one to come back and check if she had not. Then she walked south until she found Coldwater Creek. The settlement sat in a shallow basin between two low ridgelines. 140 people living in the specific way of western Wyoming cattle country in 1886, functionally without ornamentation, with a hard-earned confidence in their own competence. That was real in most respects, but had a particular blind spot built into its center. They knew how to run cattle on this land. They knew how to build structures that held against ordinary winters. They knew the rhythms of the place as they had experienced them across the 20-odd years since the first family settled here. What they did not know, because they had not yet encountered it, was the outer edge of what this land could produce in terms of cold and duration and relentless accumulation. They had experienced difficult winters. They had not experienced a winter that intended to erase everything they had built. Clara arrived in August of 1884 with nothing and asked for work. Coldwater Creek gave her what it could manage, which was not generosity so much as a kind of collective shrug. She was a problem that needed to be categorized and filed somewhere. She was passed from household to household, the Staffords for 3 weeks, then a family named Kellner, then a widow named Margaret Sims, then back to the Staffords, when Mrs. Kellner decided the girls' silences were unsettling, performing whatever labor each household required in exchange for a bed and meals, never complaining, never asking for anything beyond what was already agreed, never becoming the grateful orphan that each family in some inarticulate way had expected the arrangement to produce. The town's discomfort with Clara was real but difficult to name. She was not rude, she was not dishonest. She worked without being told twice, did not steal, did not cause disruptions. What she did was look at things too steadily. She listened to conversations between adults in a way that suggested she was evaluating rather than simply overhearing. She occasionally said things that turned out to be correct in ways that made the adults around her feel retroactively that they should have thought of those things first. In April of 1885, she told Bart Hensley at the general store that Willow Creek would flood within 5 days. She had been watching the upstream melt rate against the creek's current volume and the soil saturation level in the low fields adjacent to the bank. Hensley laughed. The 3 men in the store at the time laughed with him because the creek had been running at normal levels for a week and the sky was clear. 5 days later, Willow Creek rose 3 feet in 6 hours and took out the wooden bridge on the South Road, along with 2 horses that had been left in the adjacent pasture overnight. 3 horses actually, though the third survived with a broken leg and had to be put down the following morning. No one thanked her. The conversation in the days afterward focused on the unusual weather pattern, the unexpected snowmelt rate in the upper elevations, the particular bad luck of the timing. Clara's warning was not mentioned. It was easier that way. In August of that same year, she told the Hargrove family that a hard frost would come before the 20th of the month based on the behavior of insects in the low meadow east of town, a specific suppression of activity that she had learned to read as a cold weather precursor. Old Calvin Hargrove, who had survived 50 Wyoming winters and considered himself the region's foremost authority on its weather patterns, told her that August frosts that severe did not come this far south in non-drought years. The frost arrived on the 17th. The Hargrove family lost an apple orchard that had taken 12 years to establish. After that, Clara stopped offering her observations freely. She had learned something about the specific way that being right angered people who had been wrong, the way it left a residue that did not dissipate, but instead converted itself into a different emotion entirely, something that looked for opportunities to settle the account. She waited 14 months for the next observation that mattered enough to say out loud. The morning of September 26, 1886 was clear and cold, in the particular way of high-elevation Wyoming autumn, the kind of cold that felt invigorating rather than threatening, that made men breathe deep and feel capable. Clara had been watching for 6 weeks. She had walked the upper Beaver Ponds on the creek's North Fork in early August and found the dams rebuilt at a height she had never seen before in 2 years of observation, 2 full feet higher than the previous season's waterline. The construction urgent, the colony working in the compressed time manner of creatures who understand that the window is closing faster than usual. She had watched the elk begin their descent from the high country on September 3rd, 4 weeks ahead of the previous year's timeline, their coats already thick in a way that matched mid-October rather than early September. She had tracked the squirrel caching activity along the Cottonwood corridor and found it operating at a pace that suggested the animals were working against a deadline none of the humans around them could perceive. She had found woolly bear caterpillars on 3 separate occasions in late August and early September, every one of them black from end to end, without the brown banding that indicated a moderate winter season. These were not 4 independent data points. They were 4 instruments, all measuring the same oncoming thing. She went to the general store on the morning of September 26th because it was the place where the most people could be reached with the fewest words, and because she had calculated that the preparation window, the time between warning and the arrival of conditions that would make preparation impossible, was closing in a matter of weeks rather than months. Bart Hensley was behind the counter. There were perhaps 15 adults in the store, or visible through the open doorway conducting the ordinary commerce of a late September Saturday morning. Clara waited until there was a pause in the ambient conversation, a natural break that would not require her to speak over anyone. The winter this year is coming 6 weeks early, her voice carried without being raised. It will be the worst winter anyone in this settlement has seen. The snow will bury structures above the first-floor window lines. The cattle will die in the ravines. If preparations are not made before the end of October, a significant number of people in this town will not survive to spring. The pause that followed had a specific texture, not silence exactly, but the sound of people deciding how to respond. Hensley recovered first. His laugh was the reflexive kind, the one that a man produces when he needs to establish the terms of a social situation before he has fully processed what was said. Others followed his lead the way people do in a group setting when the first response determines the acceptable range of subsequent ones. Clara continued, "The evidence for this is observable." She described the beaver dams on the North Fork, the height, the urgency, the deviation from previous year's patterns. She described the elk migration timing and coat density. She described the squirrel behavior, the caterpillar banding. She spoke in the specific, unembellished language that her father had used, the language of observation without interpretation beyond what the data directly supported. The laughter in the room was beginning to settle towards something more uncertain when Reverend Harlan Cobb walked through the door. Harlan Cobb was 58 years old, a large man in the way that authority accumulates physical dimension over time, not especially tall, but taking up space in a room the way that a fire takes up space, drawing the air toward itself. He had come to Coldwater Creek 7 years earlier from a congregation in eastern Kansas that had folded under circumstances he described as a failure of the community's faith rather than any insufficiency in his leadership. He was the only formally educated man in the settlement, a fact he wore without apology, deploying his vocabulary and his scriptural literacy as instruments of social position in a community where those things were rare enough to function as currency. He had been at the barber shop 2 doors down. Someone had gone to get him. Clara saw this in the way he arrived with slightly too much purpose for a man who had simply been passing by. He stood at the edge of the gathered people for a moment, listening as Hensley summarized what Clara had said with the imprecise paraphrasing of a man who had not been paying close enough attention to repeat it accurately. Cobb's expression during this summary did not change. It had already settled into the position it intended to hold before Hensley finished speaking. No child knows things like this. The statement was delivered not as a question or an argument, but as a categorization, the verbal equivalent of placing an item in a box and closing the lid. This child is either being guided by something dark or she is deliberately spreading fear through this community for reasons of her own. Neither possibility reflects well on those of us who have permitted her presence here without adequate scrutiny. Clara looked at him directly. She had looked at many adults directly since coming to Coldwater Creek, and the response was almost always the same, a flicker of something between discomfort and irritation. Cobb's response was different. He met her gaze without flinching, but what was behind his eyes was not genuine engagement. It was management. He was already organizing the situation around a conclusion he had already reached. "I would like you to explain." Clara's voice was level, carrying no heat. "Which observable fact I have described is incorrect." The room became very still. Cobb smiled in the way of a man who is not actually amused. "The error is not in your facts, child. The error is in the presumption that a girl of your age with no formal education living on the charity of this community has been granted access to knowledge that has been withheld from men who have lived in this territory for decades. That presumption is not a conclusion that science or scripture supports. It is a form of pride which has never served its host well." He turned to address the room rather than Clara, and in doing so completed the social maneuver he had entered to accomplish repositioning her from someone making a statement to someone who was the subject of a statement. "I'll be bringing this matter to the council's attention." The council met in the church on the evening of September 28th. 12 men sat in the front pews. Cobb stood at the front because that was where he stood in this building, regardless of the meeting's nature. Gerald Stafford sat in the second row with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression of a man who has already decided and is waiting for the formalities to conclude. Gerald was the largest landowner in the district, a practical man in most respects with no particular interest in spiritual authority, but considerable interest in economic stability, and a girl spreading panic about catastrophic winter conditions in the middle of fall marketing season was a specific category of disruption he did not need. His son Owen sat in the back row. Owen Stafford was 14 years old, broad-shouldered for his age, with his mother's eyes rather than his father's, a quality that had occasionally made Gerald Stafford look at his son with an expression that was not quite pride. Owen had not been invited to the council meeting. He had come anyway, slipping in through the side door during the opening prayer, settling into the back corner where the lamplight did not reach clearly. No one acknowledged him. He watched everything. Edna Pruitt was not permitted to attend the council meeting. She was a woman, and this meeting's bylaws, such as they were, reflected the period's assumptions about deliberative bodies. She had sent her husband James Pruitt with specific instructions about what position she expected him to take. James Pruitt was a good man with a weakness for social harmony that had over 30 years of marriage periodically created friction between his instinct and his wife's expectations. He sat in the third row and kept his hands folded in his lap and said nothing during the main discussion. Cobb framed the matter not as a question of whether Clara's predictions were accurate. He was too careful for that, but as a question of community order. A child without family or standing was generating alarm in a settlement that depended on confidence for its economic function. Whether her statements were sincere or calculated was less important than the effect they were producing. The appropriate response was not engagement with her claims, but resolution of the underlying disruption. Gerald Stafford asked how long a separation would need to be in effect. Cobb said that was difficult to specify in advance, but that winter conditions would resolve the immediate situation one way or another. Stafford nodded at this without visible reaction to what the statement implied. The vote was taken, 8 in favor, 3 against, including James Pruitt, who surprised himself and probably his wife as well. 1 abstention from a man named Cord, who said he needed to think about it more, a qualification that arrived too late to matter. Clara was brought in after the vote was completed, not before it to be informed of the decision. She sat in a chair facing 12 men and heard what had been decided. She had been permitted to bring nothing to this meeting and would be permitted to take nothing from Coldwater Creek, except what she already carried or what the council chose to provide. Cobb asked as a formality whether she had anything she wished to say before the council closed its session. She stood up from the chair. She was small enough that standing did not significantly alter her relationship to the room, but something shifted when she rose, a quality of attention that the assembled men could not quite account for. She looked at Cobb directly. "The winter will come exactly as I described." She sat back down. Cobb closed the session. Owen Stafford, watching from the back corner, felt something move through his chest, a sensation he would spend years afterward trying to name accurately. The closest he would ever get was this. It was the feeling of understanding something true at the precise moment you realize you are not going to act on it. They gave her the wool blanket, the cornmeal, and Edmund's knife in the morning. Cobb read a short passage from Scripture. No one else spoke. The blanket was thin enough that Clara could fold it over one arm without difficulty. She accepted all three items without comment, without looking at anyone's face, without the performance of either gratitude or resentment that the assembled observers might have found easier to categorize. She walked north through the center of town and out the other side without pausing. The dirt of the main street was hard with the first intimations of ground freeze, the kind that came in late September before the real cold set in and the earth locked itself into winter rigidity. Her footsteps made no sound on it. Owen Stafford stood on the steps of the general store. He had come out without a plan, without any intention that he had consciously formulated. He stood there because he could not make himself stay inside. He watched Clara's back as she moved through the space where the town ended, and the open land began, watched the point where the land began to rise toward the first low ridge, watched the place where the ridge curved, and her figure disappeared behind it. He went inside without speaking. He did not speak for the rest of that day, a fact that his father noticed with mild puzzlement but did not pursue. Clara walked without urgency. Urgency was a form of panic managed through motion, and she had learned early that panic consumed resources, physical, mental, caloric, faster than almost any other state. She moved at the pace that covered the most ground with the least expenditure, a rhythm she had found alongside her father on long trapping circuit days when they needed to cover 12 miles, and had agreed to stop arguing about whether 12 miles was too far for a 7-year-old. The land north of Coldwater Creek rose gradually through sagebrush flats and then more steeply through the foothills that buttressed the Wind River Range's lower shoulders. She knew this terrain in the general way of someone who had walked through it twice, both times with Edmund, both times en route to specific destinations he had wanted to show her. She was navigating now not toward a memory of a specific location, but toward a remembered category, the red-gold sandstone escarpments that appeared at the point where the sagebrush country gave way to the first real elevation where the rock became the primary feature of the landscape rather than its skeleton. She ate cornmeal, sparingly mixing small amounts with creek water in the hollow of her cupped hand. She slept the first night in the depression left by a fallen cottonwood, using the root ball as a windbreak, the wool blanket pulled tight. The temperature dropped into the low 20s before dawn. She woke with the blanket stiff with condensation at its outer surface, her body heat having migrated through the layers and frozen at the interface with the air. She pressed her hands against her chest for several minutes before trusting her fingers to work reliably, then rose and continued north. On the second morning, the terrain changed in the way she had been looking for. The sagebrush thinned, then gave way entirely to a landscape of rock and sparse dry grass and the occasional wind-twisted juniper. The escarpment appeared first as a color on the horizon, red-gold distinctly warm against the gray-blue of the surrounding stone, and then as a vertical feature, a wall of stratified sandstone rising 40 feet above a small valley floor, where a spring moved through the rock in a thin, clear thread. She walked the base of the escarpment for a quarter-mile before she found what she had been looking for. And not finding, it was not something she had considered a real possibility, because Edmund had told her that sandstone faces of this type and age almost always contain natural fracture lines, the geology of the stone creating them as reliably as pressure creates release. The fracture was narrow, an adult could not have entered without forcing, and forcing would have been wrong, because the stone on a compressed fracture line was under tension and unpredictable. But Clara was small even for 11, and the gap was wide enough for a body of her dimensions to move through without force turning sideways, exhaling to reduce diameter. The interior space was the size of a large wardrobe, cold smelling of mineral earth and the faint biological musk of something, a porcupine perhaps, or a skunk that had used it at some point in the past season. The ceiling was irregular but averaging perhaps 5 feet. The floor was flat sandstone covered with a thin layer of decomposed material that had blown in through the fracture over years. The walls were rough, but not dangerously so. The stone itself, when she pressed her palm against it, had the slightly chalky texture of sandstone that would yield to sustained pressure from a harder material. She withdrew Edmund's knife from her belt and held it for a moment. The handle had been shaped by his hands over the 20 years he had carried it, the wood worn smooth at the contact points, the blade showing the particular pattern of repeated careful sharpening that produces a slightly asymmetric edge. She had carried it for 2 years since his death. She had used it for everything that required a blade. This was a different use, not cutting or scraping in the usual sense, but sustained patient pressure applied over weeks and months. She set the edge against the sandstone wall and began. The first stroke removed a thin curl of pale stone the size of her thumbnail. The second removed another. The process was slower than she had hoped and faster than she had feared. The stone was not particularly hard, sandstone rarely was, but there was a great deal of it between the current dimensions of this space and the dimensions that would make it habitable through a winter of the severity she had described to the people who had sent her here. She worked until her arm failed, which happened sooner than she would have preferred. She slept. She woke and worked again. On the fourth day, she tried to test the ventilation for a fire. She gathered dry grass and a few fragments of juniper bark from outside, arranged them in the corner of the interior space, and produced flame using the steel strike method her father had taught her, the back of the knife blade against a piece of flint she had found at the creek edge below the spring. The flame caught. The smoke rose. It rose into the enclosed space and found no exit. Clara understood what was happening approximately 30 seconds before her body overrode her understanding with more urgent priorities. She got to the entrance and through it without clarity about the sequence of movements involved, emerging into the cold afternoon air, on her hands and knees, pressing her forehead against the rock, coughing until her eyes ran and her chest felt like something had wrung it out by hand. She lay on the flat rock outside the fracture for several minutes, looking at the sky, which was cloudless and very blue and entirely indifferent to the situation. The problem was solvable. She knew this before she had fully recovered her breath, because the problem was architectural rather than fundamental. Smoke needed a channel to the exterior that was positioned above the fire, rather than lateral to it, using the physics of rising heat to drive the movement of air. The fracture she had entered through was not that channel. She needed to find or create one. This would require finding a natural weakness in the stone above the current ceiling, which would require more removal of material, which would require more time. She sat up. She calculated the available time against the required work. She calculated the caloric cost of the work against her current food acquisition capacity in this terrain. The numbers did not produce certainty, but they did not produce impossibility either. She went back inside with a flat piece of quartzite she had found at the creek, harder than sandstone, suitable for use as a hammer against a bone-shaped piece of the same material that could function as a chisel, and began working on the ceiling. 3 days later, she found the natural fracture line she had been looking for, a hairline crack running diagonally from the upper corner of the interior space toward the exterior face of the escarpment. She worked it carefully, enlarging it by fractions, testing with small amounts of smoke at each stage. On the afternoon of the 9th day, she lit a fire in the corner of the interior space and watched the smoke rise, find the fracture, and travel upward through the stone to emerge in a thin line from the face of the escarpment, 12 feet above the valley floor. She sat back and watched the fire burn. The heat built against the stone walls with a quality she recognized from the descriptions her father had given her of shelter. In extreme conditions, the stone absorbing warmth and becoming slowly a radiating surface, rather than a cold one. The interior temperature rising in the gradual, durable way of thermal mass, rather than the fast and failing way of open-air combustion. She stayed in that state for perhaps 10 minutes, which was the longest she had permitted herself to be still since leaving Coldwater Creek. Then she went out to check her rabbit snares. The snares had been set the previous evening using techniques Edmund had refined over years. Not the simple loop and stake method most trappers used, but a modification that improved the trigger sensitivity and reduced the rate of escape for animals that had partly sprung the mechanism before being caught. She had constructed them from strips of wool unraveled from the blanket's edge, twisted into cord, combined with thin, flexible branches cut from the willow stand below the spring. Each snare had taken perhaps 40 minutes to construct and set correctly. She had set 4. 2 were empty. One held a jackrabbit that had been dead long enough to be cold, but not so long as to be a food safety concern. One held a cottontail that was still alive and addressed the situation with the specific, focused terror of a creature that understands exactly what has happened to it. She collected both, reset the empty snares, and carried her results back to the escarpment. Ash appeared on the 9th day. Clara was at the spring before dawn, filling the container she had improvised from the remaining portion of the wool blanket wrapped around a bowl-shaped piece of sandstone that held water through surface tension and careful handling. The Mustang came out of the shadow of the escarpment's curve to the south, moving slowly in the way of an animal that is not actively fleeing, but is not comfortable either, a gait that communicated alertness without panic. Gray-coated, distinctly thin, the ribs showing in the first light, with the particular definition that comes from a long period of inadequate nutrition. The left rear leg moved with a slight irregularity, not a full limp, but a compensation, the kind of adjustment a joint makes when it has been stressed and has healed imperfectly. Clara did not move. She remained in the position she was in when the horse appeared kneeling at the spring's edge, and she reduced her own movement to the minimum required to continue breathing. She did not look at the horse directly. She had learned from Edmund, who had learned from long observation, that direct eye contact from a predator-facing angle was the fastest way to end a potential interaction with a prey animal before it had become anything useful. The horse drank from the spring 20 feet to her left. Clara watched the surface of the water and tracked the horse's position through peripheral vision. When the horse finished drinking, it raised its head and stood for a long moment in the posture of a creature, deciding whether the information it has gathered is sufficient to support a conclusion. Then it walked back the way it had come around the curve of the escarpment and was gone. Clara waited until the sound of its movement disappeared entirely before she stood up. She had seen the horse. The horse had seen her. Neither of them had made a decision yet. She came back to the spring at the same time the following morning with a handful of dried grass from the valley floor, the stalks still carrying some of the late summer protein content, and she placed it on the flat rock beside the spring and knelt 15 feet away in the same posture as the day before. The horse arrived 20 minutes after dawn, later than the previous day, a testing of the variable. She recognized the kind of adjustment a cautious intelligence makes when conditions have changed. It drank, it looked at the grass, it ate the grass slowly with the particular deliberateness of an animal that has decided to engage with an ambiguous situation while maintaining the capacity to disengage instantly. It did not approach Clara, but it did not leave until it was ready to leave. On the fourth morning, it came to within 8 feet of where Clara knelt. She extended her hand palm up with a second handful of dried grass. The horse considered this arrangement for a period of time that Clara estimated at 4 minutes, though she was not watching any clock, only the quality of light shifting on the valley floor. Then it stepped forward, lowered its head, and took the grass from her hand. She named it ash for the color of its coat. Not gray, exactly the gray that ash produces when the burning is complete, and only the mineral residue remains a color that contains all the information about what had burned and gives none of it up easily. The arc of the autumn light shifted in the late afternoon of that day, the sun dropping behind the escarpment earlier than it had the week before, and Clara understood that October was nearly present and that her timeline was not flexible. She had a fire that worked a space that was growing toward habitable, two reliable snare locations, a spring that had not yet frozen, and a horse that had not yet decided to leave. She went back inside and picked up her quartzite tools and continued cutting. Coldwater Creek on the evening of September 29th was conducting its ordinary business with the specific confidence of a place that has made a decision and is not yet required to live with its consequences. The cattle were in the south pastures fat and calm. The general store had inventory through spring. The church on Sunday would be full, and Reverend Cobb would deliver a sermon on the danger of false prophets and the importance of protecting a community's spiritual integrity, and the assembled people of Coldwater Creek would nod along because the sermon would feel true in the way that self-justifying narratives always feel true before events arrive to test them. Owen Stafford went to bed that night without eating dinner, which his mother noticed and his father did not. He lay in the dark of his room and thought about a girl walking north across the sagebrush flats with a blanket over one arm, and the way she had not looked back, not once, not even at the edge of town, where the road curved and a person could look back without anyone inside the settlement necessarily seeing them do it. She had not looked back because she had already decided that looking back was a closed question. Owen was 14 years old, and he understood something that he could not yet articulate, but could feel precisely that the thing that made Clara Voss different from every other person he had ever met in Coldwater Creek was not that she knew things others did not know. It was that she was not confused about the difference between what a thing was and what people wanted it to be. He turned toward the wall and listened to the wind pick up outside his window, coming from the north. He noted with the specific bite that meant something colder than usual was moving behind it, and he waited for sleep that was a long time arriving. Outside, the cottonwood leaves shook in that northern wind, gold and amber, and the last burning color before the gray set in. The temperature at midnight in Coldwater Creek was 23 degrees. 4 miles north in a valley no one in town knew to look for, a thin line of smoke rose from a crack in a sandstone escarpment and dispersed into the cold, clear sky. And inside that escarpment, a fire burned against walls of stone that were slowly, patiently learning how to hold heat. The animals in the high country were moving. The elk were moving. The beavers had already finished what they needed to build. The winter that Clara Voss had described to 15 people in a general store 3 days ago was not yet visible on any horizon. But it was already in motion, organized, certain, indifferent to the opinions of anyone who happened to be standing in its path. It was 6 weeks away. No one in Coldwater Creek was ready for it. One person, 11 years old, 4 miles north, was not yet ready either, but she was working. The first week of October arrived in the Sandstone Valley with a quality of light that Clara had learned to read as borrowed time, the sun still warm enough at midday to make the work bearable, the nights dropping fast enough to make the urgency of the work unmistakable. She rose before dawn each morning, checked the snares in the gray pre-light, brought back whatever the night had provided, then returned to the escarpment wall with her quartzite tools and worked until her arms stopped obeying her instructions. The space inside the rock was growing. Not quickly, sandstone surrendered itself in small increments, each stroke of the quartzite chisel, removing perhaps a tablespoon of material, the cumulative effect visible only across days rather than hours. She had developed a systematic approach, working the walls in horizontal bands from floor to ceiling, maintaining the flattest possible surface to prevent stress fractures that could destabilize larger sections. Edmund had once described in passing how miners work stone without compromising the integrity of what remained around the excavation. She had been 7 years old when he said it. She had not known she was memorizing it. Her right hand developed a blister on the third day. The blister broke on the fourth, the raw skin beneath making every stroke a specific negotiation with pain. By the eighth day, the skin had thickened into something that was no longer precisely blister and not yet fully callus, a transitional tissue that hurt differently than either a deep structural ache rather than a surface sensitivity. She worked through it because stopping was not an available option, in the same way that breathing was not an available option. The fire had changed the space fundamentally. Once the smoke channel worked correctly, the interior temperature at night, with a modest fire burning for 3 hours before sleep, settled somewhere between 15 and 20 degrees warmer than the outside air. This was not comfort, but it was survivable across a range of conditions that would otherwise have been fatal. The stone walls, as Edmund had described of thermal mass construction in the abstract, behaved differently from wood or earth. They absorbed the fire's heat, slowly held it, stubbornly, released it gradually through the night hours after the fire had died down to coals. A well-fed fire at sunset meant warmth until well past midnight. She was learning the rhythm of it, calibrating how much fuel produced, how much duration. Ash had begun spending nights in the valley. This was a decision the horse had arrived at independently, without any action on Clara's part, to encourage or discourage it. And she recognized that the decision carried information. An animal with the option to move to better shelter had evaluated this valley's conditions against the alternatives available in the surrounding terrain and found the valley preferable. She noted this without assigning it sentiment it did not necessarily carry. The horse was not choosing her. The horse was choosing the geography. That the geography happened to include her was a secondary fact that was nonetheless useful. She began leaving part of her food allocation, dried grass, the occasional handful of pine nuts she gathered from the trees on the valley's eastern slope, near the entrance to the escarpment, rather than bringing it inside. Ash began approaching the entrance in the early mornings when Clara was working inside. By the middle of October, the horse was standing within arm's reach of the exterior, while Clara worked the stone interior close enough that she could hear the particular sound of its breathing, the rhythm of a large animal at rest, carrying the low-frequency quality of a bellows working at minimum effort. On the 14th of October, she built the kicker frame for the secondary chamber. This was the work she had been saving for after the main space was habitable, the additional excavation that would create a separate enclosed area adjacent to the primary chamber, connected by a low passage large enough for a horse to stand and lie down in relative protection from wind. The heat exchange between the two chambers she had calculated would run in both directions, the fire's warmth moving into the secondary space through the connecting passage, Ash's body heat, the metabolic output of a 900-pound animal, moving back into the primary chamber through the same conduit. She had never built anything like this before. She was building it from principles her father had described, and her own understanding of how heat moved through enclosed spaces applied to materials she was making up as she went. It took 11 days. On the 25th of October, she led Ash into the secondary chamber for the first time slowly with her hand on the horse's neck, speaking in the low, continuous murmur that she had found reduced Ash's nervous system response to unfamiliar enclosures. The horse entered, turned around once in the tight space, then lowered its head and stood. Clara watched from the connecting passage. Ash's ears, which had been rotating in the high-alert manner of a horse processing new sensory input, gradually settled into the resting position. She exhaled a breath she had been holding for 11 days. The same night she lit the primary fire, let it burn for 2 hours, then lay down on her grass bedding and felt for the first time since September 29th. Something that was not quite warmth, but was the structural absence of cold. The difference was significant. Cold had been the constant background condition of everything she had done since leaving Coldwater Creek. Not the killing cold, not yet, but the persistent, wearing, resource-consuming cold of Wyoming October nights. Its absence, even temporary and partial, returned something to her that she had not fully recognized she was spending. She lay in the dark and listened to Ash's breathing through the connecting passage, slow and regular, the sound of an animal in a state of involuntary trust. And she allowed herself to calculate what she had built against what she still needed. What she had: shelter with functional thermal retention, fire system with working ventilation, 2 reliable food sources in the snare lines, Ash, whose presence served both practical functions, and one that she was still deciding how to categorize: the specific alteration in the quality of silence that occurred when another living creature was present, an alteration that she had not expected to matter, but found that it did. What she still needed: more food, significantly more stored against the possibility that the winter's severity would make outdoor foraging impossible for extended periods. More wood. A door. She had been thinking about the door for 2 weeks. The door problem was an engineering question that she had not immediately solved because the materials available in the valley were not ideally suited to the task. She needed something rigid enough to create a real seal against wind-driven cold, flexible enough in its construction to fit an irregular opening that she had not been able to make perfectly rectangular and durable enough to survive the expansion and contraction cycles of extreme temperature variation without coming apart. Wood was the obvious material. The valley contained cottonwoods along the creek margin below the spring. But mature cottonwood trunks of the diameter she needed would have required cutting tools she did not have, and dragging them up the slope to the escarpment would have been beyond her current physical capacity. She solved it by thinking differently about what a door needed to be. Not a solid panel, but a frame with fill structure of straight willow branches, of which the valley had an abundance in the stands below. The spring lashed into a grid and filled with the combination of clay-rich mud from the creek bank, dry grass woven into thick mats, and the outer layer of pine bark stripped from fallen trees. Each material contributed something different. The clay packed against gaps, the grass mats provided insulation. The bark added rigidity. The finished door was not beautiful. It was not even particularly symmetrical. It fit the opening of the escarpment the way a specific problem fits a specific solution, not elegantly but precisely enough to function. She hung it on a frame of heavier willow branches she had lashed into the rock, using wedges driven into drilled notches, the drilling accomplished with a pointed piece of quartzite worked in slow rotations that took the better part of a morning per hole. When she closed the door from inside and pressed her palm against the interior surface, the difference in air movement against her skin was immediate. The constant low-pressure draft that had been moving through the interior space, too gentle to feel directly, but present in the slight constant chill it produced, stopped. The escarpment's interior became a different kind of space that afternoon. Not just a cave with a fire, an enclosed space with a door that she controlled. She stood in the center of it for a moment with her eyes closed, her father's voice somewhere in the architecture of memory. The difference between shelter and refuge is the door. He had said that to her once on a trip into the high country when she was perhaps 6 years old, explaining why he always built a door on his winter camps, regardless of how short the stay was intended to be. She had not thought about it in the years since. It had returned to her now with the precision of something that had always been stored correctly, waiting for the moment the context made it retrievable. On the 12th of November at approximately 3 in the morning, Clara woke to a sound she recognized without needing to identify consciously the particular compressed silence that precedes heavy snowfall, the way the air goes still before precipitation, as though the atmosphere is inhaling before it speaks. She got up, moved to the door, opened it 2 inches. The temperature outside had dropped perhaps 20 degrees from the evening's reading, which she calibrated not by instrument, but by the behavior of her exposed skin, the way the cold hit it, the quality of the bite, the specific sensation of moisture in the air that had not been present at sunset. The sky was fully overcast, the stars gone the darkness above the valley absolute, rather than the graduated darkness of a clear, cold night with starlight. The first flake landed on the back of her hand while she stood at the door. Then 3 more. Then the volume increased in the exponential way of snowfall that intends to be serious, not a gradual buildup, but a rapid commitment, the sky releasing what it had been holding without further preamble. She stood in the doorway for perhaps 5 minutes, watching the valley floor begin to disappear beneath white. Then she closed the door, went back to the fire, added 2 pieces of wood, lay down, and looked at the stone ceiling in the dark. She had been right. She had known she was right for 6 weeks. The confirmation produced nothing in her that resembled satisfaction, because satisfaction required some investment in the outcome having been uncertain, and she had not experienced it as uncertain. What she felt instead was the specific heaviness of knowing that people 20 miles south of her were waking up to this same snow with a different relationship to it, one shaped by a decision they had made on September 28th that was now in the most literal sense beginning to cost them. She thought about the children of Coldwater Creek. She had been among them for 2 years, the Stafford children, the young Hargroves, the 3 Cord boys, the Pruitt grandchildren who visited in summers. She knew their faces. She did not permit herself to continue that line of thinking for long because it served no function that was available to her at the present moment. But she allowed it briefly, the way you allow yourself to look directly at something very bright, briefly without flinching, acknowledging what it is. Then she turned her thinking to wood inventory. She had 9 days of fuel at current consumption rates more if she was disciplined about burning during the coldest hours and letting the stone's retained heat carry the intervals. The valley's fallen timber supply was not exhausted, but the easily accessible portion the material she could collect and carry without exceptional effort was thinning. She would need to range further in the days ahead before the snow accumulated to a depth that made the lower slopes of the valley inaccessible. She revised her collection schedule before sunrise. 20 miles south, the snow that fell on Coldwater Creek on the morning of November 12th was greeted with a reaction that passed through several stages in the course of a single day. The first stage was equanimity. It was November, it was Wyoming, snow was expected. The second stage, reached by early afternoon, when the accumulation exceeded what an ordinary November snowfall should have produced by that hour, was something closer to reassessment. The third stage, reached by evening, when the temperature had not risen above single digits, and the cattle in the south pasture were pressing against the fence line, in the specific manner of large animals whose instincts are sending them a message. Their enclosure prevents them from acting on, was the beginning of concern. Gerald Stafford stood at his kitchen window in the early dark of that evening and looked at the fence line where his cattle were massing. He was not a man given to visible emotion, which had served him well across 20 years of a business that rewarded steadiness. But his wife, watching him from across the kitchen, saw something move across his face that she had not seen there before. Not fear precisely, but the progenitor of fear. The moment before fear, when a competent person begins to calculate the gap between what they have prepared for and what appears to be arriving. Owen was at the table behind his mother working on a ledger entry his father had asked him to complete before dinner. He was not watching his father. He was thinking about something he had been thinking about intermittently since September 29th. A thought he had never voiced to anyone that surfaced now with renewed intensity in direct proportion to the depth of the snow against the window. Clara Voss had been right about the timing, which meant she had likely been right about the severity, which meant that what was currently falling outside the window was not the winter. It was the beginning of the winter. The cattle losses began 3 days later. They did not die all at once. The first deaths came from exposure in the lower ravines where the animals had moved instinctively to escape the wind on the open pasture, not understanding that the ravines would fill with drifting snow faster than the flat ground. Ranchers found the bodies in the morning stiff, the snow packed around them in the manner of something that has become part of the landscape rather than a temporary visitor to it. 4 head the first week, 12 the second. Then the rate of loss accelerated as the temperature dropped further and the feed that remained accessible beneath the snow diminished toward nothing. Gerald Stafford lost 400 head by the first week of December. The Hargrove operation, the second largest in the district, lost 360 across the same period with Calvin Hargrove, spending his mornings walking the fence lines in temperatures that were, his wife would later say, not fit for any living thing to be outside in for longer than the time it took to get from one warm structure to another. The Hargrove brand had been the dominant cattle operation in this part of Wyoming for 18 years. It was not going to survive this winter. Calvin Hargrove knew this by mid-December, the knowledge settling into him in the patient, devastating way that certainties settle when there is nothing to be done about them. By Christmas Day, Bart Hensley's general store was empty of everything that mattered. The supply wagon from the east had not come in 3 weeks. The road south was blocked by drifts that no team could push through, and the community's collective pantry, which had seemed more than adequate in October, had been drawn down by the combined demands of a population that was burning more fuel, eating more calories, losing more livestock, and receiving no resupply. Children were brought to the store by mothers who stood in the empty aisles for a moment before their faces settled into expressions that their children would remember for the rest of their lives. Reverend Cobb preached on Christmas morning to a church that was less than half full. The missing members either too cold to make the journey through the drifts or too sick to risk the exposure. He preached on the theme of divine testing, on the purifying function of hardship, on the specific grace available to communities that maintain their faith through adversity. The sermon was technically accomplished. He had never been anything less than a skilled orator. But there were faces in the pews that listened to him with an expression that was new. Not disagreement, not open doubt, but a particular quality of attention that a man of his experience should have recognized as the look of people who are computing whether what they are hearing has any operational value for their actual situation. He did not recognize it. He concluded the sermon, offered a benediction, went home. January arrived with a ferocity that stripped the last residue of equanimity from Coldwater Creek's population. The storms came in sequence, each one barely clearing before the next began its approach from the Canadian north, stacking one on top of another in a procession that felt less like weather and more like intention. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero in the second week of January and held there for 11 days, not warming to zero, during the days not rising above -20 at the warmest point of the afternoon. The cold at that register was not the cold of ordinary winter experience. It was a different category of phenomenon, one that operated on materials as well as living things. Wood contracted until joints failed. Metal became fragile. The moisture in eyes and nasal passages froze at the first exposure. The first human death came on the evening of February 3rd. Calvin Hargrove, 71 years old, who had homesteaded this land in 1868 and built everything the Hargrove operation had become from nothing, who had survived the drought of 1879 and the range war of 1882 and the grass fire of 1884, that had burned 6,000 acres of his best pasture land, lay down in his bed after supper and did not get up from it. His wife found him 2 hours later. The doctor, summoned through the cold by a neighbor's boy, said the heart had simply stopped, worn through by the combination of cold exposure, inadequate nutrition, and the specific weight of watching 50 years of work unmake itself in the space of 3 months. The church bell rang the following morning, muffled by the snow packed against the bell tower's walls, the sound coming through the cold air with a dampened quality, as though the weather was absorbing even sound. After Hargrove, the children began to show the effects. The Henderson baby, 8 months old, developed a fever in the second week of February that the doctor could not break because he had no quinine and nothing that would have served in its place. The Poole twins, 6 years old, developed coughs that deepened daily, the sound audible through the walls of their house to the neighbors on either side. The doctor had 12 families requiring attention and no medicine for any of them. He was doing what doctors in that situation do, providing presence in the absence of intervention, being a warm body in a room full of cold ones, offering the thing that costs nothing, because everything that costs something has run out. Owen Stafford, 15 now by virtue of a birthday that had passed unremarked in January, was chopping the last of the furniture that could be sacrificed for fuel, 2 chairs and a side table from the parlor, when his younger sister appeared in the doorway and said that their father wanted everyone in the kitchen. The Stafford family assembled around the kitchen stove, the warmest room in the house, the room they had been progressively retreating into as the winter had made the outer rooms first uncomfortable, then uninhabitable. Gerald Stafford stood at the window that faced north. His face had aged in the past 3 months in a way that aging over years does not produce a specific compression, the look of a man who has been processing something very large in a very small amount of time. The Voss girl. He said it without turning from the window. The name had not been spoken in this household since September. It arrived in the kitchen with the particular weight of something that has been held in silence for too long. She said she knew how to survive in the mountains. She said her father taught her. Owen set down the axe. His voice when he found it was more level than he expected. She was right about everything else. Gerald Stafford did not argue this. The absence of argument was in itself a kind of answer to a question that no one had put into words yet. He turned from the window finally, his eyes moving to his son's face with an assessment that was part practical, part something harder to name. If she's alive up there, and if she knows things we don't know about getting through this. He stopped. The sentence had an ending that he could not quite bring himself to complete in front of his family, because completing it meant acknowledging the full weight of what September 28th had put in motion. Owen completed it instead, not in words, but by going to get his coat. The council met 2 days later informally in the kitchen of the doctor's house, because the doctor's kitchen was the warmest available space that wasn't someone's private bedroom. 8 men. Gerald Stafford, who had been the most influential voice for the expulsion, sat without speaking for the first portion of the meeting, while other men articulated haltingly what everyone had already privately concluded. Owen had not been invited. He had come anyway, standing in the doorway rather than taking a seat, a posture that said he was not asserting a right to be there, but was not going to be removed either. The practical question, once it was finally stated plainly, was this: if Clara Voss had survived the winter in the northern escarpment country, a proposition that no one believed was likely, but that no one could definitively rule out, she might know where food sources were, where shelter could be found, how to extend their remaining supplies against a winter that showed no sign of concluding. The moral weight of what it would mean to go looking for her after what had been done to her was not discussed. Not because it was unimportant, but because the people in that room had already done their moral accounting privately in the dark hours of the preceding weeks, and the result had been the same for all of them, a number that did not balance. The search party was organized the following morning. 5 people, Owen, his father, 3 other men who were among the strongest remaining in the settlement. They had food for 6 days. They had 5 horses, the best remaining of the settlement's herd, the others having died or been consumed. They had a hand-drawn map of the northern escarpment country that Owen had produced from memory based on his own limited experience of the terrain, supplemented by what he remembered of Clara's general description of where Edmund Voss had taken her in that country. Before they left, Owen stood in the barn and looked at the horses for a long moment. The animals were thinner than they should have been, ribs more visible than in October, but their eyes were clear. He thought about a gray Mustang in a sandstone valley and whether Ash had survived whatever the winter had brought to that terrain, and then he stopped thinking about it because that thought led somewhere he wasn't ready to go. They rode north at first light on February 18, 1887, into cold that hit exposed skin like a blade and stayed there. The days that had preceded the search party's departure had not been quiet ones in the Sandstone Valley. Claire had known since approximately the middle of January that she was working at the margin of her food supply. The snare lines had thinned out as the winter deepened, not because the rabbits had been trapped to local depletion, but because the severe cold had driven them into a kind of suspended minimal activity that kept them deep in their burrow systems through the hours when the snares were active. She was getting 1 catch every 3 days rather than the daily or near-daily take of October. The pine nut supply was exhausted. The cattail roots required breaking through ice that had thickened to 8 inches in the creek below the spring, a labor that returned a caloric surplus only if the harvest was substantial enough, which it increasingly was not. She made adjustments, reduced her own consumption to the minimum that would maintain functional cognitive capacity, allocated Ash's portion, carefully calculating the horse's minimum maintenance needs against the available supply. Spent more time resting than she would have preferred because rest was the most efficient way to reduce caloric expenditure in a period when caloric income was constrained. On the evening of February 16th, 2 days before Owen's search party rode north, Ash slipped in the secondary chamber. Clara heard it, not the fall itself, which happened faster than hearing could organize, but the impact, the specific deep resonance of a large body hitting stone at low velocity, followed immediately by the irregular vocalization that a horse produces when something is wrong at the level of involuntary pain response. She moved through the connecting passage in the dark, running her hands along the stone walls, reaching Ash before her eyes had adjusted fully to the secondary chamber's deeper darkness. The horse was standing, which was the first piece of information that mattered. Standing rather than down, which meant the injury was not catastrophic. But the left rear leg, the same leg that had carried the old compensation from before their meeting, was bearing weight in a way that communicated trauma rather than caution. When Clara ran her hands down the length of the leg from hip to hoof, feeling for the specific feedback that distinguished a structural fracture from a joint injury, she found swelling concentrated at the hock, the equivalent of a human ankle, a complex joint that, if badly sprained rather than fractured, could recover with time and appropriate support. She sat on the floor of the secondary chamber with her back against the stone wall and put her hands on her knees and thought. The calculation was straightforward in its elements and brutal in its conclusion. Ash needed more food than Clara had been allocating in order to support the metabolic cost of healing. Clara did not have more food. Clara had food for approximately 4 days at current allocation rates, less if she shifted more to Ash. If she shifted her own share to Ash, she could extend the horse's recovery support for perhaps 6 days, but Clara herself would be at significant risk of incapacitation from caloric deprivation before those 6 days concluded. She sat in the dark with this for a long time. The reasoning that emerged was not sentimental. She had been watching the South in the abstract way of someone who tracks the logic of a situation rather than its immediate visual evidence since the first heavy snow. The people of Coldwater Creek were not equipped for this winter. They would reach a point where their survival required external knowledge they did not possess. When they reached that point, they would come north because there was nowhere else to go, and she was the only person they knew of who had that knowledge. They would not come while they still believed they could manage. They would come when they could not. By her calculation, they were at that point now, or very close to it. If they came, she would need Ash. Not for companionship, for the functional reason that navigating the northern escarpment country in deep winter conditions required the mobility that a horse provided, particularly for a person who might need to cover significant terrain quickly while simultaneously managing a large group of people who did not know the land. She would not need Ash if she could not demonstrate to the people coming that there was somewhere to go and a way to get there. The horse was infrastructure. The horse was part of the system. She transferred her food allocation to Ash over the following 2 days, keeping for herself the minimum she calculated she could function on, which was not comfortable, not safe by any margin she would have preferred, but was survivable across a defined short interval. She built a leg support from willow branches and strips of leather, worked it onto the hock joint with the patient precision of someone who had one chance to do it correctly. She spoke to Ash throughout in the low, continuous murmur that had always reduced the horse's response to unfamiliar handling, and Ash endured the wrapping with the specific dignity of an animal that has learned to extend conditional trust to a specific individual. On the morning of February 20th, 2 days after Owen's search party had ridden north, Clara checked the leg. The swelling had reduced by perhaps a third. Not healed. Moving in the right direction. She went to her food supply and counted what remained. 2 days, maybe 3 if she was very careful. She had not eaten a full portion in 4 days. Her hands, when she held them in front of her face in the morning light that came through the smoke channel, were steadier than they had any right to be. She thought of what her father had said once on a day when a trapline check had returned nothing. Hunger is information, not emergency. The body is telling you something you already know, that you need to find food. The mistake is letting information become panic. She went out to reset the snares for the 4th time that week, moving through snow that had crusted overnight into a surface that held her weight for the most part, before randomly giving way, the irregularity of it more tiring than consistent deep snow would have been. The sky was clear, the temperature at its morning low, the sun barely clearing the eastern ridge of the valley, with a light so flat and white, it looked like something that had forgotten how to warm. She checked the first snare. Empty. The second empty. The third held a jackrabbit dead frozen stiff in the cold that had settled overnight. She stood over it for a moment before picking it up. The animal was thinner than the rabbits she had been catching in October, the body reserves depleted by a winter that had taken from everything it touched. She reset the snare, put the rabbit inside her coat against her body to thaw it as she walked, moved to the 4th and final snare. The 4th snare had been sprung but held nothing. Something had triggered the mechanism and escaped. She knelt and examined the snow around the stake. The tracks were there. A cottontail smaller than the jackrabbit, having approached from the west, triggered the snare, somehow cleared it in the moment of spring. She could see the track of its departure, the irregular spacing of panicked movement disappearing toward the willows below the spring. She reset the snare for the last time that morning, knowing that resetting it was partly mechanical habit rather than genuine expectation. Then she walked back up to the escarpment in the clear, cold morning, the frozen jackrabbit inside her coat, and sat at the entrance to work with the fire's warmth on her back. She was eating slowly, deliberately, making the food last in the most calorie-efficient way she knew when she heard the sound. Horses, more than one, moving through the crusted snow of the lower valley with the heavy, effortful gait of large animals pushing through terrain they cannot move easily in. Coming from the south. She set the food down, stood, looked. 4 figures on horseback moving along the valley floor. Then a 5th slightly behind on a horse that was struggling more than the others. They had followed the creek margin, the most logical route, which meant they had found the valley by following the water rather than by knowing where to look. Someone had reasoned their way here rather than remembered their way. She watched them for a moment. They had not seen the escarpment yet. They were looking at the valley floor, at the walls of stone on either side, searching for something. Then she saw from the angle of light that had shifted enough by mid-morning to illuminate the upper face of the escarpment that the thin smoke from the ventilation crack was visible above the stone, rising in a line too straight for any wind-dispersed natural source. One of the riders stopped, pointed. The others looked up. Clara stood in the entrance of the escarpment, in the place where the door had been pulled open, watching them find her. She was small in the scale of the valley, and the light was behind her, making her a shadow in a dark opening in gold-red stone. She watched the lead rider, the youngest of the 5, broad-shouldered on a horse that was managing the terrain better than the others, process the sight of the smoke process, the sight of the opening process, finally the sight of the figure standing in it. He rode toward her. The others followed. She waited. Everything she had built since September 29th was about this moment, not as its purpose. Surviving had been the purpose, the work had been its own justification, but as its consequence. The people of Coldwater Creek had sent a child out to die. The child had not died. She had built something instead in the stone and the cold, out of what she had been given and what she had been taught. Now they were here. She had known they would come. She had not let herself consider until this moment whether what she felt about that was anything other than practical. Owen Stafford dismounted 15 feet from the escarpment entrance, his breath coming visible in the cold air, his face older than September winter-aged, in the specific way she recognized from her father's face, after difficult seasons, carrying something that was not quite hope, because hope implies uncertainty, and what was in Owen's face was beyond uncertainty now, past the point where hope was the relevant concept. He was looking at her with the expression of a person who has arrived at a destination they were not sure existed. She looked back at him. The valley was very quiet in the way that deep winter open spaces go quiet. The snow absorbing sound, the cold suppressing the biological noise that fills the air in other seasons. The smoke from the escarpment rose straight up into the blue. Neither of them spoke first for a moment that held the weight of everything that had happened since September 29th. The expulsion, the building, the first snow, the deaths in Coldwater Creek. The 4 days of hunger, she was still metabolizing the legs she had wrapped on a horse in the dark. All of it was present in that moment. Neither of them was going to pretend otherwise. It was Clara who finally closed the practical distance. How many people are left? Owen's chest shifted with the answer before he found words for it. 112. Mostly women and children. Some men. A pause that carried things he wasn't ready to sort through. Some of the men left to find food and didn't come back. She absorbed this without visible reaction. 112 from 140. How many horses can pull a loaded sled? 3, maybe 4. How much food do you have left in the settlement? A week. Less if it needs to stretch to cover people who aren't eating enough already. She looked past him at the 4 other men who had remained mounted, watching the exchange with the careful attention of people who have arrived somewhere they didn't expect to be allowed to reach. Gerald Stafford was among them. He met her gaze briefly, then looked at the stone face of the escarpment. She stepped back from the entrance. Come in. Get warm. There's something you need to understand before we talk about what comes next. They came in. The interior of the escarpment, the smooth carved walls, the flat stone floor, the fire burning in its engineered locus, with the smoke traveling cleanly upward, the stored supplies organized along the back wall. The sound of ash moving in the secondary chamber produced a silence in the 5 men that Clara recognized as the silence of a recalibration. They were updating what they had believed was possible. Gerald Stafford was the last one through the door. He stood with the low ceiling close above his hat and looked at what a child had made in stone in 3.5 months. His jaw was tight in the way of a man restraining an expression that would cost him more to release than to contain. Clara waited until they had all absorbed the space for a moment. Then she began. There is a valley 3 miles east of this position. My father showed it to me when I was 8. The elk winter there because the cliff walls on the north side block the prevailing wind and the snow doesn't accumulate to the same depth. If your hunters go there, they will find game. There are also natural caves in this escarpment that can shelter families. The stone holds heat the same way this one does. A pause then. The work of making them livable is significant. The alternative is staying in Coldwater Creek and running out of options in a week. Owen was watching her face. There was a question he needed to ask that he hadn't yet located the precise shape of. He found part of it. Why are you telling us this after what? Because I'm not the mountain. Her voice didn't rise, didn't harden. The mountain doesn't care about any of this. It just is what it is. I'm not the mountain. I can choose what I do with what I know. The fire moved in the stone hearth. Ash shifted in the secondary chamber. Somewhere outside, the Wyoming wind was building again across the northern ridge. She gave them the rest of the afternoon to rest. There was work beginning in the morning, and the morning was going to arrive whether any of them were ready for it or not. They spent the rest of February 20 inside the escarpment, eating what Clara could provide from her remaining stores, which was not much distributed across 5 additional people, but was warm, which mattered more than quantity at that particular moment. She fed Ash before herself, a fact that Owen noticed without comment. Gerald Stafford sat against the carved wall with his knees drawn up and his hat in his hands, looking at the floor in the way of a man conducting an internal audit. He could not stop once it had started. Clara spent the afternoon asking questions rather than answering them because the information she needed was operational. She needed to understand exactly how many people in Coldwater Creek could walk under their own power, how many would require transport, which children were youngest, what structural condition the remaining horses were in, whether anyone in the settlement had rope, how much of it, what tools remained. The men answered with the directness of people who have passed beyond the stage where managing information serves any useful purpose. Owen answered most precisely, having spent the weeks of the settlement's decline cataloging losses with the obsessive attention of a person who needs to impose some form of order on chaos, even when the order serves no immediate function. By the time the light outside the smoke channel shifted to the flat orange of late winter afternoon, she had the information she needed. We leave in 3 days, she told them. Not a suggestion. The same tone she had used in the general store on September 26th, the specific register of someone reporting a condition rather than proposing a course of action. You go back tomorrow, tell everyone what you found, tell them what to bring. The day after, prepare. 3rd day, you start north at first light. I'll meet you at the creek crossing 2 miles north of the settlement boundary. Gerald Stafford looked up from the floor. His voice, when he found it, had lost the particular authority it had carried in October. The people who are too sick to walk. The 3 strongest horses on your end pull sleds. Assign the most fragile passengers first, then children under 5. Everyone else walks. The route I'm taking avoids the worst wind exposure, but it adds distance. It will take between 16 and 20 hours depending on conditions. She paused. People need to understand before they leave that the journey itself carries risk. 3 days ago, the temperature was 40 below. If it drops again while we're in transit, they'll come. Owen's voice was flat with certainty. There's nothing left in Coldwater Creek worth staying for. She looked at him. The fire moved between them. Reverend Cobb. A pause settled into the space between them, dense with what it contained. Owen's face held something she read as the intersection of guilt, exhaustion, something that wasn't quite anger but was in the same neighborhood. He won't leave the church. We've tried. His voice dropped to a register that carried more weight than volume would have. He says he won't follow a child into the wilderness when God can provide in place. Clara was quiet for a moment. The fire's light moved on the smooth stone walls she had made with her own hands, one careful inch at a time, across 3.5 months of mornings that had started before dawn. She thought about Harlan Cobb in an empty church with a Bible on his knees, conducting a negotiation with the universe on terms the universe had not agreed to. She thought about the specific nature of a pride so complete it could not fit through the door of a child's rescue without breaking itself on the frame. He's made his decision, she said finally. We don't have people to spare for someone who has decided. No one argued. The moral difficulty of that conclusion was visible on some of the faces in the firelight, but the arithmetic was not disputable. The next 2 days moved at the speed of irreversible things. Owen rode back to Coldwater Creek on the morning of February 21st, with his father beside him carrying the information of what they had found in their saddlebags alongside the physical cold. The reaction in the settlement was not the relief Clara had calculated, because relief requires a moment of safety to land in, and there was no moment of safety in Coldwater Creek in late February of 1887. What it was instead was the activation of something that had been dormant under the weight of weeks of diminishing options, a forward motion, purposeful and focused, in the way that surviving creatures become focused when a path opens that was not visible an hour before. Edna Pruitt organized the women's preparations with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for something actionable since September. She had been the one dissenting voice in the council meeting, overruled, subsequently managing the gap between what she had argued for and what had been decided in the private architecture of her daily conduct. Now she moved through the settlement with a list in her head that she had apparently been composing for some time, assigning tasks with a precision that brooked no negotiation. Bedding rolled, tools sorted by weight, and necessity food stores, consolidated, children briefed in the specific calm language that adults use when they need children to understand that something serious is happening without triggering the particular fear response that makes serious things harder. Owen packed his own kit in 30 minutes, then spent the rest of the preparation time helping families who were struggling with the decisions about what to carry. The calculus was brutal in its simplicity. Weight slowed movement, slowing movement, extended exposure, time extended exposure. In current conditions, increased mortality risk. A family that packed too heavily to move at adequate pace was making a decision that the cold would evaluate without sentiment. Gerald Stafford said almost nothing during those 2 days. He moved through the preparation with competent hands, performing familiar tasks, checking harness, loading sleds, assessing the horse's condition with the practiced eye of a man who had been reading horse health for 30 years. But the internal processing that was happening behind his eyes was not visible to anyone who looked at him directly. Owen looked at him once on the evening of February 22nd and saw something he had not seen in his father's face before, the specific look of a man who has arrived at an honest accounting of himself and found the balance sheet worse than he had been prepared for. They gathered at the settlement's northern edge in the dark before first light on February 23rd. 112 people, reduced to the mobility of their most vulnerable members, organized around 3 horse-drawn sleds and the practical choreography of a population that had never been asked to move itself as a unit. The temperature was negative 22 degrees. The sky was clear, which meant no new precipitation, but also no cloud insulation, the cold radiating from the bare sky with the clean efficiency of a landscape that has stripped itself of everything that moderates the exchange between the Earth's surface and the upper atmosphere. Clara was at the creek crossing when they arrived, sitting on ash. The horse's leg wrapped tightly, the gait still slightly uneven but load-bearing, functional in the gray pre-dawn light. She looked at the column of people emerging from the scrub to the south, and she counted, because counting was the first operational act. 107 visible. 5 more on the sleds, she confirmed as the sleds came around the willow stand. 112. Owen rode to her position at the column's head. He looked at Ash's leg for a moment. Will she hold up for the distance? She'll manage. Clara turned Ash north. Stay close to the person in front of you. If you lose visual contact with the person ahead, stop moving. The route has 3 landmarks I'll describe as we reach them. At each one, wait for confirmation that everyone has cleared the previous stretch before moving forward. She looked back at the column, the faces, the breath rising in visible clouds above the group. The children in arms or bundled onto sleds, the expressions of people who have decided that whatever comes next cannot be worse than what they are leaving behind. The valley is 16 miles. We stop once at the halfway point in a ravine that blocks the northwest wind. No one sits on the ground. Everyone stays moving their extremities. She turned ash north without ceremony. The column began to move. The first 6 hours were the hardest in the physical sense. The terrain north of Coldwater Creek was open country with limited wind protection. The trail Claire had chosen threading between the exposed saddles and staying to the lee sides of the low ridge lines where the snow was firmer and the wind hit at an angle rather than straight on. She set a pace that was calibrated to the slowest mobile member of the group, which shifted as the morning progressed. First, the older adults who were weakest from the weeks of inadequate nutrition. Then, as the first 10 miles accumulated, the children who had seemed strong at the start, but whose smaller bodies lost heat faster than adult metabolism could compensate for in continuous exertion. Clara moved back through the column twice during the first 6 hours, checking conditions, making adjustments to sled loading, identifying individuals who were showing signs of thermal insufficiency, the specific grayish coloring at the extremities, the slight unsteadiness in gait that cold compromised circulation produces before the more dramatic symptoms arrive. She moved 3 people onto the sleds, redistributing existing passengers to accommodate them, making the calculations about weight distribution and horse load with the speed of someone for whom this kind of assessment had become automatic. The woman she was most concerned about was not a child. Margaret Hobbs, 63 years old, had been among the weakest of the settlement's population before the winter began, a chronic lung condition, having reduced her respiratory capacity over years. She was walking under her own power, which was her stated non-negotiable, but the sound of her breathing by mid-morning was audible to anyone within 10 feet, a wet, labored quality that the cold was making worse with each inhaled breath. Clara rode back to Margaret's position in the column. Without preamble, "You're going on the sled." Margaret's response came through the labor of her breathing. "I'm walking, I'll not be carried." The cold between them was the third party in the conversation. Clara looked at her for a moment at the set of her jaw, the specific dignity of a woman who had survived 63 years by maintaining a position on certain things. Then, "The sled gets you there breathing. Your dignity doesn't require you to die on your feet in the snow." Something moved across Margaret's face, the word dignity, landing differently than Clara had expected, perhaps carrying a resonance that reframed the choice. She climbed onto the sled without another word. Clara remade the weight distribution in 3 minutes, confirmed the horse's load tolerance, moved back to the column's head. Owen had watched the exchange from 10 yards back. He thought about September 28th in the church, the 12 men in the lamplight, the absence of the word dignity in any formulation that had been offered that evening. He thought about how the same word could mean entirely different things depending on whose mouth it came from. He didn't share this thought with anyone. He kept moving. Martha Hensley died at the 7-mile mark. She had been on the center sled since the beginning, her condition visible to anyone who looked, the specific stillness that is not sleep, that does not change when the person around you shifts or speaks. The woman beside her on the sled had known for perhaps an hour before she said anything, because the knowing was an enormity that required time to approach. Owen's father confirmed it when they stopped at the wind-sheltered ravine for the mid-route rest. He covered her with a blanket from the sled's load, said a few words that were not from Scripture, because no one asked him for Scripture, stood for a moment with his hat in his hands in the cold. Clara was told. She absorbed it without visible change in her expression. "We leave her here. We'll come back for her in the spring." A pause. "She'd want us to keep moving." No one challenged this. The column moved. 2 more deaths came before the valley, both children under 6 months old, both on sleds, both already in the compromised state that the weeks in Coldwater Creek had produced before the journey began. The column absorbed these losses in the way that a body in extreme conditions absorbs pain, registering it, continuing to function, integrating the information without stopping, because stopping was not an option that the terrain or the temperature made available. Clara knew by the time the sandstone escarpments became visible through the late afternoon light at approximately the 16-mile point that she had lost 3 people. She had calculated the possibility of losses before the column left Coldwater Creek. The calculation had not made the fact of the 3 deaths lighter. It had made the fact of the 89 survivors, the count she ran in her head as the valley's floor began to open around them, comprehensible in the context of what the alternative had been. The caves were what she had described, natural formations in the same escarpment system, their interiors rough-walled where her own had been carved smooth but oriented correctly, relative to the prevailing wind opening onto the protected valley floor, with the thermal mass properties of the same red-gold sandstone. She had identified 6 in the weeks before the search party arrived, assessed their dimensions, estimated their capacity. She had been right about all 6. She assigned families to caves with the decisiveness of someone who had already done this planning and was now executing it. The process took perhaps 2 hours, moving people sorting fuel, establishing fire protocols in each new cave, demonstrating the specific building sequence that created a fire capable of warming stone walls rather than merely occupying the space between them. She moved between all 6 locations multiple times in those first hours, checking correcting answering questions in the brief practical language of someone who had limited time to ensure that every group understood enough to keep itself alive through the first night. Owen followed her through most of it, not because she needed assistance, but because he was the person in the settlement most capable of learning what she was demonstrating quickly enough to serve as a relay for others. He watched how she built the fire where she placed it relative to the back wall, how she managed the airflow through the cave entrance to feed combustion without creating the draft that would strip heat as fast as the fire produced it. He asked questions that were precisely the right questions, the ones about the principle rather than just the procedure, so that when conditions varied from what she was demonstrating, he would be able to adapt rather than fail. This was, she recognized, a form of intelligence that not everyone possessed, the ability to extract the underlying rule from a specific example. Edmund had had it. She had inherited it or learned it so early that the distinction no longer mattered. Owen Stafford, she was discovering, had arrived at it through a different path, but had arrived there nonetheless. By the second evening, the 6 cave communities had their fires working. Their food supplies consolidated, their sleeping arrangements organized against the stone walls in the way that preserved body heat through proximity without the carbon dioxide accumulation that killed people when they slept in enclosed spaces with inadequate ventilation. Clara had checked every cave's ventilation before she was satisfied. It was full dark by the time she returned to her own cave, where Ash's breathing in the secondary chamber had the familiar rhythm of the animal's settled state metabolism, and the fire had been burning for 4 hours, and the walls were giving back warmth with the passive generosity of stone that has been patiently accumulating it all day. She sat by the fire and ate the first full portion she had permitted herself since February 16th. The food was not good. It was rabbit-dried hard reconstituted in meltwater over the fire until it was edible rather than pleasant. She ate all of it. Then she sat for a long time in the particular quality of silence that falls when a defined phase of effort has concluded, when the immediate task has been completed, when the body understands that the emergency, at least the immediate emergency, has passed. She was 12 years old. The calculation arrived in her head with the mild surprise of a fact she had not recently considered. She had been 11 when she walked north from Coldwater Creek on September 29th. Her birthday had come in early January unannounced to anyone, observed by no one, passing through a night that was indistinguishable in its qualities from the nights before and after, except that she was aware of it. She sat with the fire and did not try to make the number mean anything in particular. The following 6 weeks were the test of a different kind of endurance than the autumn's solitary construction had been. Managing 89 people in 6 cave communities required a continuous investment of social energy that Clara had never been asked to produce before. She was one person in possession of knowledge that 88 others needed in varying degrees, operating in conditions where the gap between adequate knowledge and inadequate knowledge was still potentially fatal. She established a daily circuit, moving through each cave in sequence, spending time with the hunting teams before they went out, reviewing what they had found the previous day, adjusting the search patterns based on animal movement evidence. The Elk Valley produced consistently as she had known it would, but even a large herd sustains a finite extraction rate before it collapses. So she taught the hunters the specific harvesting discipline that kept the population viable while meeting the settlement's needs. Not everyone received this instruction with good grace. Several of the men were experienced hunters who found the pedagogy from a 12-year-old girl somewhat difficult to accept on its own terms, a fact that they expressed through the specific passive resistance of people who cannot argue with results but cannot quite bring themselves to acknowledge the source. Clara did not argue with them. She adjusted her approach when direct instruction produced resistance. She framed things as questions that led the person to the correct conclusion themselves, so that the knowledge arrived in a form they could accept. Edmund had called this working with the grain of the wood. She thought of it as a tool like any other, neither good nor bad, only effective or ineffective depending on the material. Edna Pruitt became her most reliable adult ally in those weeks. Not because Edna deferred to her. Edna Pruitt did not defer to anyone by temperament, but because Edna was the settlement's practical intelligence in the social domain, the way Clara was its practical intelligence in the physical survival domain, and they recognized in each other a shared orientation toward what worked rather than what was comfortable. Edna organized the cave community's internal management, the care of children, the distribution of food, the identification of individuals who were deteriorating despite the improved conditions. She reported to Clara each morning in the circuit with the same concise directness that Clara used herself. The children, as Clara had observed 2-year experience of Coldwater Creek's population, learned faster than the adults. She spent an hour each afternoon with whoever wanted to learn the specific observational skills she was trying to transmit: plant identification, beneath snow animal track, reading fire management, weather sign reading. The children came to these sessions with the specific, focused hunger of people who have recently discovered that knowledge has immediate survival value, which is a different quality of learning from classroom acquisition, more urgent, more permanent in its retention. Owen attended every session. He was 15, old enough that the sessions were nominally beneath his social standing in the settlement's implicit hierarchy, young enough that he did not care. Gerald Stafford attended twice. He sat at the back and said nothing, watching his son take instruction from a 12-year-old girl in the firelight of a cave in a Wyoming winter. What he was thinking during those sessions was not something he ever described in the explicit terms that would have made it recordable. What he did after the second session was go back to his assigned cave, sit down next to his wife, and say in a voice that was quieter than his usual register, "I don't know how to fix September 28th, but I think we need to be honest about what happened and why." His wife had been waiting for this specific sentence for 5 months. She did not say anything. She took his hand, which was enough. They did not learn about Reverend Cobb until April. The snow began releasing its grip on the lower elevations in the last week of March, the melt starting in the south-facing slopes where the winter sun had the most direct angle, then spreading slowly across the basin as the temperature finally reluctantly climbed above the freezing point for the first time in months. The road south became passable in the first week of April, not comfortable, not dry, but navigable by careful movement. The return to Coldwater Creek was not triumphant in the way that returns from adversity are sometimes described. It was quiet, tired, weighted with the accounting of what had been lost. 23 people had died in the settlement before the evacuation. 3 had died on the journey north. 89 had lived through the winter in the stone caves of the escarpment country. The numbers were what they were. The living carried them without ceremony. They found Coldwater Creek in the condition that an abandoned settlement sustains through a severe winter. Some roofs collapsed under snow. Weight fences down the livestock structures, empty the general store's contents long since consumed or redistributed. The church stood intact, the wood frame having held against the winter's force, the stovepipe still attached to the south wall. Owen was the one who found Cobb. He had gone into the church ahead of the others the way he had slipped into the back of the council meeting in September, not because he had a plan, but because he could not stay outside. The church's interior was cold in the deep way of enclosed spaces that have not been heated for weeks, the cold static, rather than moving the kind that had settled into every surface without the circulation that living bodies and burning fires create. Harlan Cobb sat in the minister's chair at the front of the church. Upright, which was the first thing Owen noticed, not slumped, not fallen, but seated with a posture that the cold had preserved in the position he had occupied. His Bible was open on the small table beside the chair, the pages still flat despite the weeks of unattended moisture and cold, the text visible. Owen did not read what passage was open. He stood in the aisle for a long time looking at the man who had called Clara Voss a child with dark guidance, who had organized her expulsion, who had then refused to be saved by her knowledge. There was no satisfaction in what Owen saw. There was something else, the specific, heavy recognition of a waste so complete it defied the usual vocabulary of tragedy. Cobb had not been a foolish man. He had not been a cruel one exactly, or not only that. He had been a man whose sense of himself had been so thoroughly constructed around his role as the arbiter of his community's moral architecture that he had been unable to survive the moment that architecture was definitively proven wrong. The cold had killed his body. His inability to revise himself had killed everything else earlier. Owen went back outside, told his father. Gerald organized the arrangements with the practical decency of a man who had decided that whatever his feelings about Cobb, The human obligation to the dead was not contingent on his assessment of how they had lived. The gathering happened in the second week of May, when the grass in the basin had come back green and the cottonwoods along the creek had leafed out in the yellow-green of their annual return. Not in the church. The church held too much of what had happened, the weight of it distributed through every board. The people of Coldwater Creek assembled on the open ground in front of Bart Hensley's rebuilt store, the building having survived the winter with its walls intact, the interior requiring only cleaning and restocking to become functional again. There was no formal call to order. People arrived in the morning, gathered the way communities gather when something needs to be said, and everyone knows it, but no one has yet determined who should say it first. The sky was cloudless. The temperature was 50 degrees. The wind that had never stopped during the winter was quiet. Owen Stafford stood up. He was 15, nearly 16, with a quality about him now that had not existed in September, not age exactly, because age comes from time, but the specific compression that comes from having carried something very heavy for a very long time. "We voted to send a child into the wilderness to die," he said. Not loudly. The morning was quiet enough that he did not need volume. She had told us the truth. We did not want the truth she was telling, so we found a reason to call it something else. We sent her out with a blanket and a bag of cornmeal in late September, in a territory none of us could have survived alone, and we told ourselves we were maintaining the peace of this community. He stopped for a moment. 23 people died in this settlement before the evacuation. 3 more died on the road north. 3 of those deaths were young children. Clara Voss, who we sent out to die, is the reason any of the rest of us are standing here. The assembled people were quiet. Not the uncomfortable silence of people waiting for someone to deflect the accusation. The deeper silence of a community that has already completed this accounting internally over many months and is hearing its own conclusions spoken for the first time in public. Others spoke afterward. The mothers whose children had survived because of Clara's caves, the hunters who had found the Elk Valley, the families who had learned fire management in the caves and carried it back to Coldwater Creek. Edna Pruitt spoke briefly with the precision of a woman who has been right before everyone else and does not need to labor the point. Gerald Stafford spoke last among the adults, standing with the stiffness of a man who has prepared something he would prefer not to deliver, but has decided the delivery is owed regardless. "I was the most influential voice for expulsion," he said. "Not a confession, exactly a statement of record delivered with the quality of something that will not be retracted, regardless of how it is received. I had reasons that I believed at the time were practical reasons. They were not. They were the reasons of a man who found a child's certainty inconvenient and used the available mechanisms to remove the inconvenience. The practical cost of that decision was counted in the lives of people in this community. I can't undo it. I can acknowledge it honestly in front of everyone who was affected." Clara was standing at the edge of the gathered community, Ash beside her. The horse's leg fully healed by now, the coat filling out in the spring grass with the gradual restoration of an animal returning to its natural condition. Clara had spent the morning at the escarpment, as she had spent most mornings since the return. There were things there that were not yet finished, would not be finished for years. The work of the cave's expansion having only begun in what the settlement's winter had made necessary. She was not at the edge of the gathering because she was excluded. She was at the edge by choice, the same way she had stood at the edge of things since she was 9 years old, and arrived in this settlement with her father's knife on her belt, and found that the edge was where she could see everything clearly without being caught in the middle of it. When the testimonials concluded, people turned toward her. Not with the formal expectation of a ceremony, but with the attention of a group that has said its piece and now waits for whatever response the person at the center of all that saying chooses to offer. She walked forward through the assembled people, not to the front, but to the middle where she could be heard without raising her voice. Ash stayed at the edge, unconcerned. She looked at the faces, the same faces she had memorized on September 28th in the lamplight of the council meeting, noting then that she would need to know exactly who had made this decision. She had not been wrong about needing to know. The winter had clarified the meaning of each face added to it, a depth that the lamplight of that evening had not contained. "My father told me once that the mountain doesn't judge," she said. "It doesn't care who you are or what you've done or what you think you deserve. It only asks whether you're prepared. He said that human beings are different, that we carry the things that happen to us, that we judge each other, that we fear what we don't understand." A pause, the Maylight moving on the faces around her. "He also said we can choose what we do with what we carry. The mountain can't choose. We can. She looked at Owen, who was watching her with the expression of a person who is memorizing something for reasons he doesn't fully understand yet. She looked at Gerald Stafford, whose jaw had the same tight set she had observed in February, in the firelight of the escarpment, still working on an accounting that might never fully balance. She looked at Edna Pruitt, who met her gaze with the level steadiness of a woman who has been waiting to see how this particular young person was going to land on this particular question. I don't know how to forgive what happened, Clara said. Not an accusation, a statement of genuine fact delivered with the same unembellished precision she brought to every other observation she had ever made in this settlement. That's not something my father taught me how to do. But I'm glad you're alive. I'm glad the children are alive. She let that sit for a moment. If anyone wants to learn what I know about reading the land, I'll teach it. That's what I know how to offer. She stepped back. The gathering continued around her the way life continues in the space that words have opened. She went back to the escarpment that evening, riding Ash through the late afternoon light across the basin floor, the new grass bending in the same wind that had tried all winter to kill everything in its path. The sandstone escarpments turned gold in the late sun, the color deepening as the light dropped the stone, doing what stone does in that hour, holding the warmth that it would give back slowly through the night. She had brought Edmund's knife. She had carried it all winter, used it for everything that required a blade, slept with it beside her on cold nights, for reasons she had not examined closely. Now she stood outside the entrance to the first cave, the one she had made herself, the one she had started with a fracture line, and a handful of quartzite tools, and the knowledge of what sandstone would yield to patience. She set the knife's point against the stone above the entrance. The blade was not meant for this kind of work, was not a chisel or a carving tool, but it was what Edmund had left her. It was the right instrument. She worked slowly, cutting each letter with deliberate strokes, applying the specific combination of pressure and angle that carved into sandstone rather than skittering across it. The letters took most of an hour. Her hand did not cramp. The stone gave way in its own time, each character emerging from the surface as though it had been waiting for someone to reveal it rather than being freshly made. When she finished, she stepped back. The mountains told me. I told you. Now we both know. She stood there for a while in the evening cold, reading the words she had put into the stone. Not for the people of Coldwater Creek, though they would see it. Not for the visitors who would come decades later, though they would photograph it. For herself primarily, a record of a specific sequence of events rendered permanent in a material that did not decay, in a place where the winter light would catch the carving every afternoon and make the letters briefly luminous. Edmund would have appreciated the precision of it. He had always valued the precise statement, the thing said exactly as it was, no more, no less, without the additions that people reflexively apply to soften the edges of what they mean to say. Ash snorted behind her, a soft equine comment on whatever was taking so long. Clara turned, put her hand briefly on the horse's neck, remounted. They moved back toward the valley floor in the last of the light, the escarpment at their backs, the settlement somewhere to the south still glowing with whatever fires had been rebuilt in the hearths of a community learning to exist in a different relationship to the land it occupied. Coldwater Creek rebuilt as places do when enough of their population survives, and the people who survive have been stripped of the certainties that had been simultaneously their confidence and their vulnerability. The cattle industry recovered slowly, never fully reaching the scale it had achieved before 1886, the knowledge of what that winter had cost making the new ranchers more cautious in ways that were sometimes commercially inconvenient, but proved across subsequent decades to be correct. The store was restocked, the damaged structures repaired, the road south made passable again before the following autumn. The annual preparation cycle changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would have been legible to an outside observer who didn't know the before, but concretely the beaver dams on the North Fork were checked in August by a rotation of volunteers, their height recorded and compared against the previous year's baseline. The elk migration timing was observed and noted. Fuel reserves were built to twice the level that had been considered adequate before 1887. These practices were attributed to no one in particular in the settlement's ordinary conversation, having been absorbed into collective habit with a thoroughness of knowledge that has been learned through consequence rather than instruction. Owen Stafford began walking to the escarpment on weekends in the summer of 1887, the first weeks of what became 3 years of irregular but serious instruction. Clara taught him without ceremony or condescension, treating him the way her father had treated her, as a person capable of understanding the underlying principles rather than just the surface procedures, giving him the information and trusting him to do something useful with it. He was a good student. He asked precise questions. He did not pretend to know things he didn't know, which was, Clara observed, rarer than it should have been in a person of his background. Other students followed. Children first, then adults. A group that began calling themselves among themselves with some self-deprecating humor, the students of the escarpment. They arrived in the valley in the summers and learned to read the land in the specific way that Edmund Voss had spent his life refining, transmitted through the daughter who had memorized it all before she knew she was doing so. The knowledge passed outward through them as they dispersed across the territory to settlements in the Wind River Basin, to the communities along the Green River, to ranches in the Bighorn country where winters could be as severe as the one that had tested Coldwater Creek to its limit. The phrase that traveled with these students embedded in the way of phrases that survive, because they compress something true into a small space, was listen to the animals. It was used without mystical connotation, without the implication of anything beyond what it literally described: the practice of treating animal behavior as data, comparing it against established baselines, using the result to inform preparation. Edmund's method distilled to 4 words moving through Wyoming across the final decade of the 19th century, in the mouths of people who had learned it from a girl who had learned it from a man who had spent 20 years in the mountains paying attention. Clara Voss lived in the escarpment for 63 years. She never returned to live in Coldwater Creek proper, though she went there regularly through the decades as a guide, as a teacher, eventually as the region's acknowledged authority on the kind of knowledge that sat between formal science and the accumulated practical wisdom of sustained observation. She never married, not for any particular stated reason, but because the life she had built in the Stone Valley was complete in a way that did not seem to require addition. She was not lonely in the conventional sense. The escarpment complex grew to 8 chambers over the years, capable of housing 30 people, regularly occupied by students who came for weeks at a time. Ash lived for 27 years, a long life for a horse that had been thin when Clara found it, that had survived a winter that killed animals far better provisioned. The horse died in the fall of 1913 and was buried in the valley below the spring, not with ceremony exactly, but with the specific attention Clara gave to things that had mattered. There was always a horse after that, different horses, each one named for the season in which Clara found it. An October chestnut she called Ember, a February gray she called Sleet, a June sorrel she called Copper. Each one occupied the secondary chamber. Each one contributed its metabolic warmth to the primary space. The winter of 1949 was a mild one. By Wyoming standards, the beaver dams on the North Fork had been moderate in height since late August, the elk migration arriving on schedule rather than early. Clara, who had been reading these signs for 63 years, knew in September that the winter would not be difficult. She was 74 years old. Her hands, which had done the original carving with a quartzite chisel and a hunting knife, still bore the calluses of that first winter. The skin thickened in a way that no subsequent decades had softened. The architecture of what those hands had done was visible in the walls around her every day. She died in December in the primary chamber in the warmth of the fire-heated stone she had made herself. The last student who had been studying with her that season came in the morning and found her and sat for a long time before doing anything else because the moment required it. She was buried in the canyon above the Sweetwater beside the stone mound she had made with her own hands when she was 9 years old in the ground that held Edmund Voss. The knife was placed in the hands of the student who had been with her longest, a woman named Ruth Carver, who had first come to the escarpment at age 12 in 1921 and had never entirely left. Ruth gave the knife to her own student years later, who gave it to another. The chain of possession was documented. The chain of knowledge it represented was longer. The escarpment complex was designated a historical site in the 1960s, preserved by a foundation whose board included descendants of families that had survived the winter of 1886 to 1887. Visitors came to see the carved chambers, the original fire hearth with its smoke channels still intact, the secondary stable, the doorframe cut into the stone at the entrance. They came to understand how a child had survived what should have killed her, had built what she had no tools to build, had chosen to extend what she had made to the people who had tried to leave her with nothing. Above the entrance, in the afternoon light that came off the valley floor at the angle that struck the escarpment's face between 3 o'clock and sunset, the carved letters were visible from across the valley floor. The sandstone had weathered in the decades since 1887, the surface acquiring the patina of stone that has been through many winters, but the cuts themselves were deep enough to hold their definition. Each letter sharp-edged precisely spaced the work of hands that had spent months learning exactly how much pressure stone required before it gave way. The mountains told me, I told you. Now we both know. Edmund Voss had taught his daughter to read the land with the patience of a man who understood that the most important knowledge was not the kind that arrived quickly, but the kind that accumulated slowly. One season's observations stacked against another's until the pattern became visible the way the escarpment's door had been invisible until you knew exactly where to look. He had been right about the knowledge. He had been right about the patience. He had not lived to see what his daughter made of both in stone in the winter of 1886, in a valley that the wind from Canada swept clean every year without caring about any of the human things that had happened there. The wind was still doing that in the valley every winter. The stone was still holding what it had been given. The letters were still legible.